Welcome to The Explainer. I am so incredibly excited you're joining me today because we are tackling a topic that is universally recognized, widely celebrated, but honestly, completely misunderstood. When you hear the words Cinco de Mayo, you probably picture massive celebrations, vibrant music, maybe a day dedicated to honoring Mexican independence, right? Well, prepare to have your historical perspective shifted, because practically everything you think you know about this date is probably wrong. Today, we are diving into a story of sheer grit, complete financial ruin, global imperial ambitions, and a massive, unbelievable military upset.
Okay, let's dive into this and immediately shatter that big primary misconception. Cinco de Mayo is actually completely separate from Mexican independence. Mexico's actual Independence Day is September 16th, which commemorates events from way back in 1810. Cinco de Mayo, on the other hand, is May 5th, and it commemorates a very specific event in 1862. That is literally more than half a century later. So if it's not about declaring independence from Spain, what exactly happened in 1862 to warrant such a lasting legacy?
Section 1. A nation in deep debt. Because before we can even talk about the battle on May 5th, we first really need to understand the absolute financial ruin of the mid-1800s.
So, back in 1821, Mexico won its independence from Spain, but doing so left the country with incredibly weak institutions and just a massive mountain of debt. Fast forward to the late 1850s, and the country is essentially tearing itself apart in the Reform War. This was a brutal internal conflict between liberals, who wanted sweeping changes and less church and military power, and conservatives, who favored traditional, centralized authority. Now, this war absolutely devastated the country's economy. So by 1861, when the liberal president Benito Juarez comes into power, he finds his nation backed into a desperate financial corner. To stabilize his country, Juarez is forced to make a seriously bold move. He completely suspends all foreign debt payments for 2 whole years.
Now, we're not just talking about pocket change here. And this debt was owed to 3 major European superpowers: France, Spain, and Britain. As you can probably imagine, telling 3 of the world's most powerful empires that they aren't getting their money for a couple of years, yeah, that didn't go over well. Suspending these payments immediately provoked Spain, Britain, and France into action. They didn't just send an angry letter. They literally sent their naval forces across the ocean directly to the coast of Mexico to demand their money.
However, once those fleets actually arrived, the alliance quickly splintered. Spain and Britain eventually negotiated deals with Mexico and chose to pack up and withdraw their forces. They really just wanted to be paid. But France stayed. And more importantly, France escalated the situation. You see, they had ulterior motives that went way, way beyond just collecting on some unpaid loans.
Which brings us to Section 2. The French army advances. With negotiations completely off the table for the French, Emperor Napoleon III ordered his forces to begin marching inland from the Gulf Coast.
Napoleon III saw an incredible opportunity here. He didn't just want a check. The man wanted an empire. His ambitions were massive. He wanted to establish a French-controlled monarchy right there in Mexico, dramatically expanding French influence in the Americas. Furthermore, he saw a strategic opening to counter the growing power of the United States. And why was that possible right at this very moment? Well, because the United States was entirely distracted, tearing itself apart, fighting its own civil war. Napoleon thought he had the absolute perfect window to establish a massive imperial foothold.
Now, what's really interesting here is the terrifying David versus Goliath mismatch this created. On one side, you have the Mexican forces led by General Ignacio Zaragoza. He's got roughly 2,000 to 4,000 soldiers. They are poorly equipped, and honestly, many are just local indigenous fighters and hastily assembled militias. On the flip side, you have the French advancing with 6,000 to 8,000 elite, highly trained troops. At this time, the French army was widely considered one of the absolute best military forces on the planet. They had vastly superior weapons, unshakable discipline, and tons of combat experience.
Section 3. The Battle of Puebla. So this elite French war machine marches steadily inland, expecting very little resistance, until they arrive near the city of Puebla on May 5, 1862.
But here's where things get wild. A brilliant tactical strategy can actually overcome raw power. First, the outgunned Mexican army uses the terrain to their advantage. They heavily fortify 2 elevated positions, Fort Loreto and Fort Guadalupe. Second, the French, perhaps a bit too arrogant and expecting a quick, easy victory, launched these direct, exhausting uphill assaults against the forts. Third, the Mexican forces hold their ground beautifully. They repel these repeated attacks and then execute these brilliant cavalry counterattacks that completely disrupt the French lines. The result? Step 4. After hours of grueling combat, the seemingly invincible French army is forced to retreat.
Let the magnitude of that victory sink in for just a second. The historical reality of that day was clear. The loss shocked Europe and inspired Mexican resistance. An underdog, poorly equipped local militia had literally just repelled a major global superpower. It was an astonishing symbolic triumph against impossible odds, and it delivered a massive, much-needed boost to Mexican national pride and unity. It proved to the entire world that Mexico could and absolutely would fiercely resist foreign domination.
Section 4. The Empire and Republic. Because while the Battle of Puebla was brilliantly won, the broader war was far from over.
So the crucial point we have to understand is this sobering reality. The Battle of Puebla did not end the French intervention. Eventually, France regrouped, continued their march, and succeeded in capturing Mexico City. By 1864, they actually achieved Napoleon's goal and installed Maximilian I as the emperor of the Second Mexican Empire, forcing President Benito Juárez to flee and lead a resistance government. The victory at Puebla, therefore, was a massive turning point in national morale and psychological resilience, but it was not the military end of the conflict.
However, global geopolitics is kind of like a giant chessboard, and the board was about to change drastically. In 1865, the United States Civil War finally came to an end. This is a massive shift, because a unified United States is no longer distracted. America can now look south and forcefully invoke the Monroe Doctrine, basically demanding that European powers stay out of the Americas. And this brilliantly illustrates the final collapse of the French imperial dream. The U.S. begins applying heavy diplomatic and military pressure on France in 1865. Facing this pressure, plus the relentless, ongoing Mexican resistance, France ultimately decides the venture is just too costly and withdraws its troops by 1867. Without the backing of the French military, Emperor Maximilian's regime rapidly crumbles. He's captured and executed that same year, and Benito Juárez officially restores the independent Mexican Republic.
Which brings us to our final section, why the Defiance matters. As we move into our conclusion, we really have to ask ourselves, how do we remember this incredible defiance at Puebla today?
It is absolutely crucial to correct the modern narrative here. In Mexico today, Cinco de Mayo is actually not a major nationwide federal holiday. It is primarily observed in the state of Puebla, right where the actual battle took place. It's recognized locally with solemn military parades and historical reenactments. So it's a day that commemorates resistance against foreign imperialism and national resilience, rather than the nationwide party that it's kind of become in other parts of the world. From an educational standpoint, the Battle of Puebla is the perfect 19th century case study of asymmetric warfare. This is exactly what happens when two sides have vastly different levels of military power. The underdog just cannot win a traditional head-to-head fight. Instead, they have to rely on brilliant strategy, intelligent use of terrain, and unbreakable morale to bridge the gap against a superior force. And General Zaragoza and his men, they executed this flawlessly.
And that really brings us to the core emotional takeaway of this entire explainer. Morale and leadership can absolutely outweigh advanced military technology. France had the guns, they had the training, and they had the reputation. But Mexico? They had the grit. They had the fierce determination to defend their homeland. Human resilience fundamentally broke, at least for a crucial moment, the arrogant ambition of a global empire.
So I'm going to leave you with this final, thought-provoking question to ponder long after this explainer is over. The soldiers at Puebla didn't let the stats or the odds dictate their actions. When facing seemingly impossible odds in our modern world, how can the spirit of asymmetric defiance, that reliance on strategy, grit, and unyielding morale, continue to reshape history? Think about that for a bit. And always remember the true power of Mayo 5th. Thank you so much for learning with me today.